Hello and welcome to The Curator on Monocle Radio with me, Carlotta Rebello. Over the next 60 minutes, we'll be bringing you some of the very best interviews and reports from the past week of coverage on Monocle Radio, with highlights from our studios here at Midori House and from around the world. This week,
the North Koreans have realised that their warm relationship with Russia may be time-limited, and they've been reaching out to China. This could just be part of a wider pattern of warming between the two countries.
China reopens travel to North Korea, one of the world's most secluded countries. Then we'll ask if Cuba is the next target on Donald Trump's list. Plus,
we are not just one of the greenest, but perhaps one of the bluest capitals in Europe.
we meet the new mayor of Helsinki at City Hall. All that and much, much more coming up over the next hour here on The Curator with me, Carlotta Rebello. So welcome to this week's edition of The Curator. Despite the ongoing military strikes in Iran, US President Donald Trump has been sizing up his next potential conquest, Cuba. But would he actually strike the country? Monocle's Andrew Muller told us all about it in this week's edition of the Foreign Desk Explainer.
Early in the United States and Israel's current war with Iran, US President Donald Trump sought to head off speculation about the width of his attention span by reassuring that he wouldn't get bored with the conflict.
Somebody said today, they said, oh, well, if the president wants to do it really quickly, after that he'll get bored. I don't get bored. There's nothing boring about this.
President Trump, however, has never been a one-thing-at-a-time kind of guy. 66 seconds after issuing that declaration, he was discussing the White House curtains.
I picked those drapes in my first term. I always like gold, but I think we can save a lot of money. I just saved curtains.
This week, more seriously and/or ominously, and despite the ongoing operations in the Persian Gulf and the disputable success thereof, Trump has been sizing up his next conquest. The lucky country is Cuba. As with all of Trump's threats or promises, three questions are raised. Would he do it? Could he do it? And should he do it? Given that these come up in neatly ascending order of complexity, that's the order we'll do them in. Would he do it? Very probably. It is clear by now that Trump wants part of his legacy to be a 51st star on the US flag. Neither Canada nor Greenland proved much interested in this, and it might prove a tough sell in Venezuela, although Trump also floated this prospect this week in an online commentary on Venezuela's triumphant progress in the World Baseball Championships. If the criteria for statehood and possible renaming to Trumpachusetts or Donaldania are proximity and vulnerability, Cuba seems like the better option. Could he do it? Short answer, probably. Longer answer, well. The Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces, as they are officially known, are obviously no match for the US military. Cuba's Air Force is a Soviet aviation museum and not even a big one. The prides of its Navy's fleet are a pair of half-century-old Spanish fishing trawlers fitted with Soviet-built Styx missiles on whose reliability you would not wish to bet your boat, never mind your nation. The tricky part would be taking Cuba by land. Mountains, jungles, irritated locals, a combination which, in a different time and place, proved hauntingly irksome to American ambitions. But one would expect, though with this administration it is unwise to take anything for granted, that any invasion would be better planned than the last time the US had a proper crack at Cuba in 1961. The reluctance of then-President John F. Kennedy to order the invasion of Cuba during the missile crisis of 1962 was born of fear of Cuba's Soviet patron, not Cuba itself.
That is why this latest Soviet threat must and will be met with determination.
Which gets us to, should he do it? It depends who you are. If you're pretty much but anybody but Donald Trump or a few excitable types in his immediate circle, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Miami-born son of Cuban immigrants, is believed especially keen, the answer is obviously not. Cuba is no threat to the United States. Wars cost a fortune, people, American and Cuban, would die, the world would think the US had gone mad, or perhaps, all things considered, madder. The prize would be a bankrupt, dysfunctional island which cannot even keep its lights on. Earlier this week, Cuba's power grid collapsed, blacking out much of the country. Cuba had long relied on oil shipments from Venezuela, which now appears to be under instruction from the United States to cut Cuba off. Energy shortages mean everything shortages: food, water, medicines. If you are Donald Trump, however, and hello, Mr. President, if you're tuning in, please understand that this is a foreign affairs explainer, not a policy pitch like if you do this, don't thank us. There is an undeniable appeal. Taking Cuba would demonstrate and project American strength. It would make headlines. It might even have domestic political utility, in that sweeping away the remnants of the Castro Revolution would be a big hit among many Cuban communities in the US, founded as they were by people who fled Cuba because of the Castro Revolution. And Cuba is, as Trump would see it, the real estate opportunity to beat them all. Before the Castros and Che Guevara overthrew the gruesome military dictator Fulgencio Batista in 1959, Cuba was a playground of gleaming hotels and glitzy casinos, patronized by more or less exactly the kind of Americans you might now find stumping up the $1 million initiation fee for membership of Mar-a-Lago. All of this is right there at the edge of what Trump insists is called the Gulf of America. Talks are taking place between Cuban and US officials, although in much the same way it has to be suspected that talks could be said to be taking place between an inconvenient seafront property owner and a developer's goons dangling him by his ankles from a hotel room window on an upper floor. The US is believed to be insisting on the departure of Cuba's president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, and other Castro holdovers, including a few Castros, the release of political prisoners, and the opening of Cuba's economy to American business. None of these would be bad things in and of themselves, but all of which sound rather less benign when Trump's general tone is considered.
I do believe I'll be having the honor of taking Cuba. Whether I free it, take it, I think I could do anything I want with it.
The irony is, of course, that if Trump does really want to be the first US president to unite another state, since Dwight Eisenhower admitted Alaska and Hawaii to the Union in 1959, he only needs to ask. The 3.2 million American citizens of Puerto Rico have voted yay in 4 referendums on statehood since 2012. For a certain sort of man, however, it's not about the having it, but about the taking it. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller.
Next, we turn to North Korea, one of the world's most reclusive nations, which is getting a renewed travel boost. China has resumed train travel to the country, and this week it announced that flights too would resume at the end of the month. John Everard is the former UK ambassador to North Korea, and he joined Chris Chermak on the Globalist.
I was kind of fortunate. There were both Air China and Air Koryo flights. So you could actually fly between Pyongyang and Beijing most days of the week. To be honest, I never took the train. The train kept and probably does keep breaking down. And the journey between Pyongyang and Beijing can get really tedious.
I can imagine that. What was the flight like? Just what kind of people were on flights to North Korea from China?
The usual weirdos and misfits. Assorted diplomats, aid workers, ne'er-do-well businessmen, and a lot of North Korean and Chinese officials, of course. The flights, Air Koryo fails every known flight safety measure. You board with a kind of deep intake of breath. Air China, of course, is a reputable airline. And Air Koryo is distinguished by being the only airline I know where you can haggle over the onboard services. They'll come round with a tray full of Korean handicrafts and tell you how much they cost, and you can say, no, I'm not paying that, until negotiate a price halfway down. on.
Haggling on the plane. I love it. Well, just tell us then, to bring us to this moment, what is behind this? Why has China made this decision to reopen travel now after about 6 years, I understand?
The quick answer, as so often with North Korea, is nobody really knows. The block never was on the Chinese side. It was on the North Korean side. They had very, very fierce lockdown over the pandemic, and they never quite got round to reopening. They let their own airline fly to China starting about 3 years ago. Air Korea has been flying since about 2023, but they didn't seem to want the Chinese airlines to compete. And why now the train service? Nobody quite knows. Curiously, they've restricted that to what they call business travel only, though how that's ever going to be monitored or checked, heaven only knows. Now, of course, China being China, as soon as the new transport facilities were announced, about a dozen different Chinese tour agencies jumped on the bandwagon and are now advertising 8-day tours of North Korea for between $1,000 and $1,300. You can secure your place with just $250. Curiously, none of them, though, include the one thing that we thought the North Koreans were building up to for Chinese tourism, which is a huge Wonsan Kalma, the beach resort that we were talking about in the studio about this time last year. So far, only Russians and North Koreans have been to be able to go there.
So is there an expectation that Chinese might be able to go there as well now that travel is resuming, or what actually happens with that?
This is the big question at the moment. Once again, we don't know. Everybody thought that the whole point of the resort was to suck lots of Chinese tourist dollars out of the Chinese economy, but the North Koreans haven't played it that way. In fact, there's no certainty that Chinese tourists will be allowed in at all. And I know this will shock you, Chris. There are people out there saying that this is just another rip-off by Chinese tour agencies. That what they're doing is taking deposits from people, knowing full well that tourism isn't going to resume, so that in a few months' time, they hand the deposits back, having had them sitting getting interest all that time.
So if tourism is not the reason for this, and as you say, we don't really know much about this, but what would North Korea like from China now that travel is resuming?
More money. I mean, the usual North Korean begging bowl is being held out. More contacts. The North Koreans have realized that their warm relationship with Russia may be time limited. Big questions over what happens once the Ukraine war ends and Russia's insatiable demand for North Korean troops and munitions starts to ebb a bit. And they've been reaching out to China. Big meetings between Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping, of course, and a lot more delegations exchanged between the two countries. So this could just be part of a wider pattern of warming between the two countries.
John, it's interesting that you mentioned the war in Ukraine there, because I'm also actually curious how the war in Iran has been impacting North Korea. Are there any worries there? Is that a reason for North Korea to maybe want to be boosting relations with China again, to have an ally?
Big worries. One of the less documented side effects of the war in Iran is that China, of course, gets about 15% of its crude oil from Iran, so the loss of that supply is a big hit, has banned all oil exports. Now, the only way that North Korea gets oil is through China, and it's not clear how much, if any, oil at the moment is going from China into North Korea. If the Chinese actually do hold back the oil originally earmarked for North Korea for their own domestic use, then North Korea's got a big problem. But the situation still is a little bit unclear. We're not quite sure what's happening there.
But that is an incredible fact. I mean, we started this show talking about Cuba, which is also facing this oil blockade as a result of what the U.S. is doing. So North Korea is basically facing the same thing right now. It
could be. As I say, we don't really know how much oil the Chinese are letting through. It may be that they simply reduce the flow and North Korea's still got just about enough oil to carry on. Neither side are releasing figures.
Now, this week, London transformed into a playground for brilliant ideas about airports as it welcomed the Passenger Terminal Expo. Roaming the halls was the journalist Zach Proctor, who joined Emma Nelson with the latest.
You're walking around, you're surrounded by models. I mean, the Foster & Partners stand was superb. It was phenomenal. You walk over to Zaha Hadid. I mean, the scale of the architecture, I think the ambition of it is just immense, and you really feel that on the ground.
Tell us, where are we going to get Foster and where are we going to get Hadid architecture popping up in terminals soon?
Well, there's a lot of focus on the Middle East, and obviously there's been a lot of focus on growth in the Middle East in the last couple of years in particular when it comes to driving that tourism. I mean, I was on the ground in Riyadh just in January, and actually you really, really feel that when you're there, is that they are preparing for something huge, which is this tourism drive in the coming years.
I mean, we do have to factor in what's happening recently in the Middle East and the fact that, if you're closing down Dubai Airport, this massively, and we're talking about the amount of the cost of passenger fuel, of aviation fuel. How much was that on people's lips at Excel yesterday?
It really was, Emma. I mean, the industry right now, I think, is in two different places at the same time. And it's a very complex moment. On the one hand, you have, as I say, this ambition, this aspiration, and all of these amazing concepts which are about to open, whether it be in Mexico City ahead of the Olympics, which are coming. But then at the same time, you are really hearing the impact of the current conflict on air travel. I mean, it's impacted so many different sectors and industries, but air travel is one of the most significant. I mean, for me, I was actually flying through Dubai on my way back from Sydney on the day the conflict kicked off, and I had just landed in Heathrow and managed to just escape it in time. But we all know somebody who is either trying to get out right now, was trying to fly through, is still got travel plan which has been derailed. I mean, British Airways this week has just announced that they're cancelling all flights through Dubai for the foreseeable, really, till the end of the summer.
Devastating stuff when you're trying to when you're effectively trying to keep the world moving. So while all that is being discussed and the long-term future of aviation is being, really poured over, we have this quite, dare I say it, strange and wild exhibition called the Passenger Terminal Expo. It has nothing to do with the aircraft itself, has it? It's got to do with how you move people from A to B and get them on a plane at the right time. And it has all the permutations of it. So talk us through it.
Exactly. I mean, the main focus this year really is on innovation for passenger experience. And what
does that mean?
That's a great question. I'm glad you asked that, Emma. I was waiting for that question. And it's interesting because there's a term we use quite a lot. We talk about seamless travel in the industry. And actually, a lot of the conversations I've been having this week are about, well, what does it mean to be seamless? What does that actually mean? And the truth is that it's actually something different to everybody. So a big focus of a lot of the talks and the conversation this year was around the idea of hyper-personalization. So technology is amazing in airports, but and we'll hear from someone from perspective on biometrics a bit later. But digitalization within airports is fantastic, but you have to be able to design for that choice. Not everybody who is entering an airport is necessarily digitally native. Some people actually want that physical interaction, and that kind of first port of call, that first human, is sometimes still really important moving forwards.
It is incredibly important. I think there are quite a few people at Monocle who would say that the day of automated check-in was the day that the fun died. But there is this balance to strike now, isn't there? Because if you are dealing with bigger and bigger passenger numbers, you can't, let's be honest, have that amazing person at check-in who issues that glorious waxy printed ticket anymore. What you end up doing is doing self-check-in with bags, which you end up talking to a person about anyway because the stuff doesn't normally work. But how much are our airports having to embrace technology?
They really are. And I think a lot of what I've been hearing this week is that airports often are legacy institutions in a sense and kind of are steeped in tradition, and they have a lot of stakeholders involved in making the decisions about the future of them. I mean, we think even just nearby us, Heathrow Airport has been debating this third runway for over 20 years now, and the decision is still yet to be kind of concretely made. So I think that airports do have to embrace innovation at a faster pace than they are right now.
And that tradition needs to be stitched into the airport's infrastructure itself. I remember when Munich Airport opened in 1995, and it was considered to be an incredibly high-tech airport. But that is 3 decades old. So tell us what they're doing.
So Munich Airport, for example, is part of this amazing consortium, which I was interested in speaking to Sharon David about. It is a kind of a world-leading and quite an unprecedented collaboration between 10 different leading international airports. And what they're doing is iterating, prototyping, testing, and sharing learnings from implementing these technologies in their airports. One of these that we touch on is biometrics. And this is fascinating to me because if you think about our perception of even that word biometrics 10, 15 years ago would have struck fear into the average passenger, the average person. It might have conjured the idea of 1984, loss of personal privacy. And actually now we're so used to using facial technologies to unlock a a phone or complete a bank transfer. So it's really become part of our everyday.
So let's hear from Sherin Daroud, who's Innovation Manager at Munich Airport.
Biometrics is one. AI is, on the rise. Of course, there are many other trends. For example, when it comes to the day-to-day business, robotics is a big thing and automation in general. So there are a lot of trends coming up, and we try to identify what's the status quo at our airport. How can we use that technology? Are we ready for this technology, or is it maybe something we have to build a foundation first?
You mentioned biometrics there, and I wonder, because this is a technology for which our perceptions of it have dramatically transformed in the last decade, and we've become so much more accustomed to facial recognition in unlocking our phones or completing a bank transfer. So have you had any adverse reactions to implementing this kind of innovation?
Biometrics is something that really is the future, but it also comes with, I think, again, a lot of challenges. You will always have great opinions about something. You will have some more critical opinions, or maybe some people which are just a little bit more, let's say, not the first movers. But in general, as we do offer different customer journeys, our passengers can decide whether they want to use that or they don't. I think, of course, the future will be a fully digital journey. Of course, for quality standards or when it comes to very specific situations, having a human in the loop is the main default, But in general, I would say that we get a very good feedback because it just runs more smoothly.
That was Sherin Daroud, Innovation Manager at Munich Airport. And talking to you about that, Zach, Sherin is clearly very clear in sort of giving people choice, which is not something which is terribly helpful in an airport, because in many ways you need to have absolutely no self-will so that you actually make it to your plane. It's almost a deliberate idea of discombobulating us. But there is that feeling that, and we're going to go back to this terrible phrase, passenger experience. What do we want now from an airport?
Well, it's a great question. I think that, here, what's really important is that clarity of choice. And we're about to hear from the Chief Operating Officer at Geneva Airport, Giovanni Russo, here. And it leads on quite nicely from my conversation with Sherin, because we spoke together about the innovation adaptation that's required for airport operations here to deal with changing conditions. So in Geneva, it might be the impact of a ski season, for example, and how an airport has to design for year-round capacity, but also kind of put moments of higher capacity throughout the year. But then more generally in the industry, and as we've discussed, there are increasingly unpredictable external factors that are really beyond anyone's control.
Our next stop takes us to Mallorca, where Monocle's editor-in-chief Andrew Tuck went searching for the remains of the home of a 1930s Hollywood star in the Bay of Palma. That's for this latest edition of Tall Stories.
If you drive out of Palma, Mallorca's sunny capital, heading west, it will only take you a short time before you reach the sea-facing neighbourhood of Illetas. In summer, its tiny coves are soon filled with the beach towels of locals and visitors keen to swim in the sea and perhaps secure a table on the concrete terrace at Bougainvillea, a restaurant right on the water's edge. The coastline here is home to some great architecture. There's the Barcelo Illetas Albatross Hotel from 1963 that retains its LA-style entrance, replete with an ancient Egyptian-style frieze. There are also the 5 towers perched on a rocky outcrop that make up Rocca Marina, the work of the late Antonio Lamela. And of course, the Hotel de Mar by Jose Antonio Cadech, another 1960s addition to Illetas. But this tall story is about none of these edifices, but rather a nice white house that once sat on the water's edge here, but which would be demolished as all this development triumphed over tranquility. But it's the residents of this house, El Molly, which make the story so intriguing. If you look up from the water's edge, you might just see the American movie star Errol Flynn and his third wife, the actress Patrice Wymore, sitting there on the terrace.
Those who sail without oars stay on good terms with the wind.
Flynn's arrival on the island is said to have been a decision of the gods, well, at least bad weather gods. In 1950, he was sailing his beloved yacht Zaka with his new wife. They were on their honeymoon across the Mediterranean when a storm forced them to take shelter on the northern coast of Mallorca. And, as still happens with new arrivals today, the island captivated them. They returned, staying at the Hotel Maricel and the Hotel Bon Sol, both in Illetas. And in 1955, the pair took the lease on El Molly, a handsome white house with a curved tower at one end that sat alone on a little bay. Flynn's residency on the island still lives on in local folklore. A man who liked his drink, women, and a good time, he frequented clubs such as Tito's, El Patio and Joe's at Plaza Camilla in the town's El Terreno neighbourhood. The pair were also visited by the likes of Ava Gardner, Orson Welles and Douglas Fairbanks Jr., and Flynn could also often be seen on his yacht at Palmer's Sailing Club. But this party would not last for very long. In 1959, aged 50, facing financial troubles, his yacht now sold, Flynn died of a heart attack. But there are still two small reminders of his and Wymore's presence in Illetas. The first is a little tiled plaque dedicated to Flynn and Wymore that was put up by their neighbours, thanking them for choosing to live here. The other is a piece of that house, a piece of that tower with a gargoyle still attached that someone rescued, which now sits in a tiny garden at the entrance to Rocca Marina. But perhaps, is there more? On the little beach where the house once stood, you spot amongst the pebbles and shells small, wave-smoothed pieces of brick. When the house was demolished, did some of the rubble end up here? Perhaps. But what is clear is that the presence of a film star who died in 1950, his talented, glamorous wife, and their house, El Molly, have not been washed away by time. And if you look carefully, squint a little as you look through the sunshine, your mind can still conjure up their home here on the beach in Illetas.
Thanks, Andrew. Still to come, Andrew Muller will tell us what we learned over the past 7 days, and we'll be meeting the new mayor of Helsinki. Stay tuned.
We're proud to support the craft of journalism. UBS brings you the latest news from around the world. Be part of an international network that brings together leading insights, research, and technology across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the center of it all. UBS. Banking is our craft.
You're with The Curator, our weekly highlights show on Monocle Radio. I'm Carlotta Rubello. Next, Monocle's Andrew Muller recaps the past 7 days for us. Here he is with this week's What We Learned.
We learned this week of continuing evolution in the thinking of US President Donald Trump.
I can't wait to see where this goes.
Okay. Tell me more. Let's see where this goes.
Knew you'd be intrigued. We learned that President Trump had reconsidered the view he held of the United States allies as recently as January, i.e. that they were a burden, an impediment, a tedious sack of whining ingrates, just a colossal pain in the knackers all round.
We have never really asked anything of them. You know, they'll say they sent some troops to Afghanistan or this or that. And they did. They stayed a little back, a little off the front lines. But we've been very good to Europe and to many other countries.
But we learned, excitingly, that said US allies were now vital strategic partners.
Tonight, President Trump renewed calls for countries that rely on oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz to send warships to secure the shipping route, the strategic waterway now largely blocked for oil exports.
We learned, however, that the response from said vital strategic partners was broadly analogous to the one any of us might expect from our own circle if we whimsically took a big old kick at a hornet's nest, elicited the response which might be broadly expected from hornets which had their nest kicked, then turned around and cried, "Come on, lads, who's with me?" Which is to say that as of this broadcast, nobody seems all that keen to get involved, as we learned, or at least inferred, from the president's inability to name so much as a single member of his proposed coalition of the grudging.
Numerous countries have told me they're on the way.
Crucially, none of them appear to have stated where they are on the way to. We continued to learn, anyway, of the importance of the Strait of Hormuz, the Persian Gulf pinch point, which is also, somewhat annoyingly on balance, the entrance to and exit from a goodly proportion of the world's energy fields. We learned that despite the exhortations of the US president, the owners, insurers and crews of oil and gas tankers remained unaccountably reluctant to sail what are essentially enormous floating bombs through a shooting gallery. But we learned that also among those vexed by the pettifogging insistence of sensitive seafarers in focusing on the negative was US Secretary of Defense and almost tragically obvious fall guy in waiting, Pete Hegseth.
The only thing prohibiting transit in the Straits right now is Iran shooting at shipping. It is open for transit should Iran not do that.
In much the same way, for example, that the Little Bighorn River was open for fording by General George Armstrong Custer's 7th Cavalry if only Crazy Horse Sitting Bull and the warriors of the Lakota, Cheyenne and Arapaho nations had chosen to cheerfully wave them through. Yes, thank you, we are aware that this is not a strictly accurate précis of the events of June 25th, 1876, but it just about holds as a comparative illustration of the perils of hubris for purposes of satirical commentary, as all reasonable people will agree. But somewhat surprisingly, we learned that at least one member of the US administration could stand no more of this nonsense.
We just learned, get this, the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Joe Kent, has just announced he's resigning.
We've still got that chorus about former UK Minister of State for Health and Secondary Care Will Quince quitting in 2023, right? Play that, but with someone saying Joe Kent over his name.
No, Joe Kent.
Surely not.
Joe Kent.
Without
Change. Joe Kent.
You're tired of
Joe Kent.
everything.
What are we gonna do?
Surely not.
For we learned, if you'll forgive the leaden sarcasm, which to be honest, if you're still listening, we'll just take as read, that the outgoing director of the National Counterterrorism Centre is maybe not quite the decent, principled yet humble whistleblower we might have hoped would take the stage circa this point in proceedings.
He is as MAGA as they come. Donald Trump endorsed both of Mr. Kent's failed runs for Congress. Kent is an election denier through and through. He peddled the fringe conspiracy theory that the FBI instigated the January 6th insurrection. He's appeared alongside far-right militia groups and associated with white nationalist Nick Fuentes.
We learned, anyway, that we were not alone in surmising that Joe Kent might not be any great loss to the counter-terrorism field generally.
I always thought he was weak on security, very weak on security.
Because whether we agree with President Trump about anything else, we can surely get together on the proposition that the last thing you want in someone in that role is weakness on security. And we, for one whimsical news monologue, tremble for whichever bungling clown-trousered idiot gave Kent the job when Donald Trump gets hold of them.
President Trump picking former Washington State congressional candidate Joe Kent to be director of the National Counterterrorism Center. Trump announced the nomination on Truth Social, saying as a soldier, Green Beret, and IA officer, Joe has hunted down terrorists and criminals his entire adult life.
Anyway, we did, however, learn of a potential new role for someone with Mr. Kent's expertise in subterfuge and camouflage. We learned that farmers in India had been driven to inventive/desperate measures by crop-thieving macaques.
And in the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh, farmers have found a unique way to tackle the money menace and save their crop.
Well, they are trying to save against the monkeys, and farmers are dressing up as bears.
Yes, we learned that the smallholders of Uttar Pradesh, weary of involuntarily feeding the local monkey population, had resorted to shambling about their paddocks in bear costumes, which are, upon reviewing the footage, frankly not all that convincing, but then monkeys aren't that bright. Don't like it? Write to the editor. That's right, you can't. You're a monkey. We hoped to learn, anyway, more about the thinking behind this adoption of ursine disguise and accordingly contacted the Uttar Pradesh Farmers Union, but they've been a bit slow responding. We will, in due course, send a follow-up asking them to explain the big pause.
Taxi for what we learned.
For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller.
Next, we head to Helsinki, where the city's youngest ever mayor, 32-year-old Daniel Sazonov, is shaking things up. Monocle's correspondent Petri Burtsov met Sazonov at the city hall.
In little bit less than a year as the mayor, Daniel Sazonov has injected a jolt of youthful energy into how Helsinki is run. He has overseen plans to introduce new car-free neighborhoods, attracted new businesses and major corporate HQs to the city, and seen a considerable tourism uptick in the Finnish capital. Sazonov bills himself as a liberal who believes in openness and tolerance. At 32 years old, Sazonov is one of the youngest capital city mayors in the world and the youngest ever to lead the city of Helsinki. I began by asking Mayor Sazonov how this generational shift affects the way he runs the city.
The age, the generation one belongs to, the overall background for me, for example, coming from a suburb of Helsinki, from social housing, and all those things, of course, influence the way you look at the city and where you can connect with citizens. If you look at the age part, actually the interesting fact is that the biggest age group in Helsinki is Helsinkians between 30 and 34. And actually almost 50% of Helsinkians are aged between 15 and 44. So actually I represent the biggest age group in Helsinki, and that I think we don't often remember, that actually cities, especially big cities, capitals, are often pretty young, our population is pretty young and they're pretty vibrant.
You've described yourself as a liberal and internationalist leader. You've done that at a time when a large part of Europe, let's say, is leaning more towards conservative and populist values, politics. How do you navigate this tension while governing the capital in Finland?
The politics in many European countries, in the US as well, are too much dominated by identity politics. And that's actually what inspires me also in the city politics and leading the capital city that is responsible for a lot of things, from the early childhood education to healthcare and social services, rescue service. That's like really wide range of things. When we concentrate on the practical things and really concrete issues that concern Helsinkians' everyday life, it actually comes to really practical questions where there is really little of identity politics, really little of like political tensions that are created just for political tensions. Of course, we still differ in views of how to organize healthcare services, or how we should balance city's economy, or where should we invest more. But in general, for me, it has been pretty good recipe to deal with those tensions, to really like put identity politics a bit aside and concentrate on the concrete things that actually also are those ones that Helsinkians are really interested in and want to be handled well.
You talked about how Helsinki is growing, but how do you balance this ambition, this growth, with Helsinki's reputation for being a very livable city and sort of human-scale city?
If we look at Helsinki, which is one of the greenest capitals in Europe, and especially if you add the sea and seafront and the archipelago that we are not just one of the greenest, but perhaps one of the bluest capitals in Europe. I think that's something that we really care about, and we have found ways to really combine the pretty dense urban development and preserving the nature and preserving the Helsinkians' smooth and fast access to the nature as well. So it's not an easy one, but we are finding a way where those two can be combined.
Outside of the Nordics, Helsinki often gets grouped together with its neighbors, cities like Stockholm, Copenhagen, Oslo. What would you say makes Helsinki distinct from these other Nordic capitals, and how do you plan to sharpen that identity internationally?
Of course, Helsinki has some special advantages, as I mentioned. We are even more green. Perhaps we have a stronger maritime identity than many of these cities. If we look at the recent developments, like in the 5-10 years, I think actually the Helsinki is in many ways much more safer. The housing, how everyday life runs and functions. So even compared to Stockholm and Copenhagen, I think that one of the great things in Helsinki is that it's big enough that it's internationally integrated and recognizable, but at the same time small enough that you really feel the sense of community and you really feel perhaps even more connected to the city than in many in those cities that are significantly bigger than Helsinki.
Let's talk about the quality of life in Helsinki next. Helsinki famously topped Monocle's quality of life ranking in 2011 and has placed really well even since then, but it hasn't been on the top ever since. What do you think is missing today, and what will it take to bring Helsinki closer to the top again in terms of the quality of life?
Livability of a city comes from a lot of different factors. It's about livability, about the growth, about the attractiveness of the city. And we see great examples. We, for example, see that Supercell has decided to build a new headquarters, 50,000 square meters. They need the best workforce from the global market. They are in a global competition, and for me those decisions tell that they really believe in Helsinki as an attractive place. We need to ensure that everyday life runs smoothly. You look at the traffic, you look at the public transport. That's why we are doing those major infrastructure investments.
And finally on today's show, we turn to the Stack, where Monocle's Ryuma Takahashi sat down with Ro Tajima, the editor-in-chief of the iconic Japanese publication Brutus.
First launched in 1980, Brutus is a Japanese lifestyle magazine that covers a remarkably wide range of pop culture topics in Japan, from film and books to music, fashion, architecture, food, travel, everything. Over the years, it has become one of Japan's most recognizable magazines, something you can find almost everywhere in the country. To understand what kind of magazine Brutus really is, and how it became so influential, I spoke with Ro Tajima, editor-in-chief of Brutus and executive officer at Magazine House.
Here at Magazine House, we also have a men's fashion magazine called Popeye. Within Magazine House, Brutus was launched as kind of the older brother to Popeye. Popeye was a magazine born out of an admiration for West Coast American culture. And then 4 years later, Brutus came along. I've heard it was started as a magazine that embodied a kind of longing for life in New York.
The topics they cover are incredibly diverse. For example, published in February 2026, one issue featured chairs and interiors under the title My Chair, My Place. But the very next issue in March was a special guide to the University of Tokyo titled The University of Tokyo Admission Guide. So what exactly is Brutus? What kind of magazine is it?
When Brutus first launched, it started out as a lifestyle magazine for men working in cities. And from the very beginning, it wasn't limited to just fashion in the traditional sense. It covered food, stories about towns, all kinds of different themes. After I became editor-in-chief of Brutus, I set one core value. That was the phrase, new perspective for all. We publish 23 issues a year, and our themes span an enormous range. So we're essentially a magazine that covers pop culture, and our goal is to bring a new perspective to all of those themes for our readers. That's why I don't think there's any topic that Brutus can't cover.
According to Tajima, because Brutus covers so many different themes, most readers in Japan don't subscribe them. They tend to pick up individual issues at the bookstore, because the cover or topics catches their eye.
I think there are almost no readers out there for whom all 23 issues of Brutus in a year fall within their interests. But I think the readers who subscribe to us want Brutus to be the thing that introduces them to worlds they didn't know. They feel like a very Brutus kind of reader to me. So rather than the same readers picking up every issue, there's a core group of fans. And then for each feature on a different theme, a different set of readers gathers around it. And those people gradually become new fans of Brutus brand.
So, how are they able to create features with huge influence that actually shapes pop culture in Japan? Tajima says Brutus has its own unique approach to generating new perspectives.
For us, pop culture means things that many people can enjoy. People often say the topics Brutus covers are very niche, but what I try to do is turn niche topics into pop culture. On the other hand, we also sometimes feature things that are already widely accepted, like musicians such as Tatsuro Yamashita. In those cases, our approach is to look at something that's already popular and present it in a more solid and specific way.
One example is the feature in 2015, Bizarre Plants Handbook, which focused on unusual and striking interior plants. This issue helped to turn the appreciation of these uniquely shaped plants into a new culture trend in Japan. In fact, the term bizarre plants itself became widely known in Japan through Brutus. The feature proved so popular that latest installment, Bizarre Plants Handbook 5, was released in May 2025.
The Bizarre Plants feature has already been turned into a series multiple times. Japanese people are said to love pursuing niche, minute details, and there's a truth to that. Shops specializing in these unusual succulents started popping up at that moment. But just covering them as a cactus feature didn't feel interesting for Brutus, so we decided to create a new word for that feature, and that's how the term Bizarre Plants was born. At the same time, we photographed those succulents with beautiful lighting, laid them out beautifully on the page and presented them in a fashionable way. By doing that, we found the meaning in having a pop culture magazine like ours cover it, rather than leaving it to professional journals.
So what is it actually like to be an editor at Brutus, making features like these? Tajima says the key word are an amateur's sensibility and curiosity.
We have absolutely no sense that we're covering cutting-edge topics. If anything, we pick up things that are authentic, ordinary, things that are just sort of out there in the world. And then we ask ourselves, what is worth covering right now? And how can we bring in a new perspective to it? And that's how we build each feature. I think magazine editors, and especially Brutus editors, shouldn't become too deeply specialized in any one field. The most important thing for a magazine editor is to be curious about all kinds of things, being interested in whatever new field is emerging at the time, bringing in experts who are strong in that field, and then, without being intimidated by those experts, being able to go up to them with that kind of amateur energy and say, "This is what I want to do." I think the people who can do that are the ones who make great editors.
Brutus has gone beyond being just a print magazine. Its digital initiatives, including its web articles, video content, have successfully expanded the Brutus brand. What does Tajima think about the appeal of print magazines and their relationship with the digital content? He sees the digital age as an opportunity for magazine editors.
In the days before the internet, magazines were also a medium for passing on information. There was a time when even something like "this movie is playing this week" was communicated through print magazines. All of that has gradually been replaced by the internet, but proposing a lifestyle, proposing a way of seeing things, appreciating beautiful photography, the internet still hasn't really been able to take over those things. And the fact that a magazine exists as a physical product in a reader's hands, I think that's going to become increasingly important in a world where more and more things are going virtual. And on top of that, as digitalization continues, the fields that editors can work in just keep growing and growing. I refer to us not as a publisher, but as an editorial company. The ability to edit, I think that's a capability that the world is going to need more and more as things become increasingly diverse. So I think our future is bright.
Finally, why has Brutus achieved such unique success that no similar magazine has managed to replicate it? What is the secret behind it?
Simply put, I think it's just because it's so hard to do. If you think about it normally, magazines are targeted media. It's actually much easier to run a magazine and easier to build a clear identity and brand. And honestly, the only way I can explain why we do it is that our history just led us here. But as a result, it becomes a style that nobody else can imitate. And if anyone tried to start something similar from scratch, it would probably just look like a Brutus copy. So we've built up enough of a brand that other magazines don't even try to enter that space.
Well, that's all we've got time for in this week's edition of The Curator. The show was produced by Jack Dewars and presented by me, Carlotta Rubello. Join us again next week for some of the very best of the programs across Monocle Radio. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.